You're listening to The Conversation. I had much rather be myself the slave and wear the bonds than fasten them on him. That's William Cowper, writing in 1784. He was Jane Austen's favourite poet, but it's hard to know exactly what she thought about the slave trade. She professed herself in love with the abolitionist Thomas Clarkson after reading his book about African slavery, and her brother Frank, a naval officer, was horrified by what he saw of the Middle Passage, the forced journey of enslaved people from Africa to the Americas. But the goods produced by these very same people, such as sugar and coffee, were luxuries now taken for granted, and the profits were sloshing around Regency England. So what were Jane's views on the matter? I'm Anna Walker, Arts and Culture Editor at The Conversation in the UK, a platform partnering journalists with academics. You're listening to Jane Austen's Paper Trail. In this podcast, experts uncover the real Jane Austen to celebrate 250 years since her birth. Book by book, we'll take you inside her work to help you understand her life. Welcome to episode 3. What were Jane's politics? Mansfield Park, Jane Austen's third novel, may well provide some clues to her stance on slavery and abolition. The story follows Fanny Price, who, aged 10, is sent to live with her wealthy relatives, the Bertrams, at the imposing Mansfield Park estate. There, she grows up as an outsider, wrestling with love, loneliness, and the moral ambiguity of the fortune made by her uncle on his plantation in Antigua. Later in this episode, I'll be discussing the novel with 2 experts. But first off, we head to Liverpool, to the Royal Albert Dock, which in the 18th century was at the heart of Britain's burgeoning empire.
You would have heard the clop of horses' hooves, you would have smelt the manure, you would have heard the shouts of stevedores, and you would have heard things being winched onto the ships, all kinds of products, cotton, fabric, iron, all of the things that were exported and then traded with, things like ivory, gold and human beings on the west coast of Africa.
This is Corinne Fowler, Professor of Colonialism and Heritage at the University of Leicester, walking the docks with my colleague Naomi Joseph.
It's a very different scene, I think, to what some of you might have assumed. About the location, we would come to talk about Mansfield Park, a book which is about country estates and the domestic concerns of those who live in them. But there is a reason we're here, right, Corinne?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we have to think about the slavery geography of Britain and all of these Atlantic-facing ports. Liverpool was the hub of all of it, and it became the most important slaving port, not just above London and Bristol, but also in Europe itself, which Jane Austen would, I'm sure, have been fully aware of.
So why are we here to talk about Mansfield Park? What is its relation to that?
It's important to set the wider context and to understand the environment in which Jane Austen was writing and the kinds of discussions and debates that were happening at the time. And of course, one of those biggest, most urgent public debates centred on slavery, the ethics or lack of ethics of slavery. And places like this, you can see the wealth all around you, from the size and the magnitude of the buildings, the width of the streets, the faded elegance of it all. Places like this were massively enriched by the slavery business. In addition to these much desired commodities produced by enslaved people, you also had these secondary industries which sprang up because the slavery wealth was then being invested in those. So there were investments in railways, slavery money bought land. There was the banking business, the insurance business, the insuring of slave ships, the insuring of plantations, the financiers who were involved in the business, the people who were involved in selling on these slave-produced goods. So all of that was absolutely a massive stimulus to the economy as a whole, because there were slave owners all over Britain.
As people have said in the past, including the post-colonial scholar Edward Said, the father of post-colonial studies, there would be no houses like Mansfield Park without the products of empire, without that structure of slavery.
Absolutely. So what Said was very intelligently doing was asking that vital question, how come plantations in Antigua were a precondition for the existence of Mansfield Park in the first place? So many country houses were bought with slavery wealth, and if they weren't bought with slavery wealth, they were improved, they were landscaped, enclosures were extended in order to consolidate these great estates, and so that money was spent in all kinds of ways far from ports like this, in really green spaces.
But it wasn't just upper class people, right? It was all sorts of people. The wealth that accrued through the slave trade were a massive form of social mobility at the time.
Yeah, and many people tried and often failed to make their money in empire and in slavery in particular. So even William Wordsworth's close female relatives tried to make money through Mississippi bonds. So it was a way of accessing wealth. And the issue of Jane Austen's position in relation to slavery itself is interesting because it's typically really ambivalent. On the one hand, she's closely and demonstrably aligned with figures like Thomas Clarkson, who was a famous anti-slavery campaigner. She really admired him. She admired the poet William Cooper. Her brothers were very involved in anti-slavery activism. So she's aligned in that way with the right side of the argument. But on the other hand, Jane Austen was really keen to inherit her aunt's wealth, which, as she well knew, came from plantations in Barbados.
I think that sort of contradiction between sympathising with the abolition movement and also wanting to inherit money might sit quite uncomfortably for modern readers. In 1813, when this book was published, what was the state of the abolition cause?
The abolition movement was incredibly active at that time, and there was a major sugar boycott around 1807, and people were trying to draw attention, as we do today, between exploitation in faraway places that we can't see and the goods that people were buying and the sugar that people were putting into their tea. So it was a massive issue, and there were many prominent black abolitionists who gave speeches, who lobbied, who wrote things to try and draw people's attention to the horrors of slavery and to push back against the propaganda of people who were pro-slavery lobbyists who were saying, oh, it's not that bad, I've seen it, and there are lots of kind slave owners. So this was the kind of atmosphere in which this novel is set.
Another contradiction of abolition at the time were the sentiments around empire and imperialism, which I think is something else that would maybe be quite complex for modern readers to get their heads around. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, so on the one hand, we can simplistically paint abolitionists as wholly good and wholly well-meaning people who were on the right side of the argument, and in many senses they of course were. But in other ways, there were all kinds of paternalistic attitudes, and there was an interference in black voices, anti-slavery voices. So, for example, Mary Prince, who was a very prominent anti-slavery campaigner who had herself experienced the worst kind of brutality on plantations, when she came to write her book, it was pretty much rewritten for her by abolitionists, so we don't really know which was her voice and what was their voice. But there was also a sense of white saviorism, as we might call it today. So many of these issues continue with us, surprise, surprise, because colonialism has so many legacies and ideas, and the ideas about race and racism are absolutely part of the legacy of colonialism.
So if Jane Austen was here today, how do you think she would describe her politics in relation to this?
I think she'd probably say that she was anti-slavery, and she wouldn't mention her aunt's Barbadian wealth.
I think that's something that modern people would do too. The shame. The shame.
That was Naomi Joseph there with Corinne Fowler. Immortalised as Jane Austen is, she was human too, riddled with contradictions like the rest of us. So what else can we find in the cracks? I sit down with two experts to find out. More after this short break.
I'm Gemma Ware, host of the Conversation Weekly podcast. Each week, I speak to an academic expert about a topic in the news to understand how we got here. From global politics to the latest scientific breakthroughs, or the big dilemmas facing our planet. My guests draw on their deep research knowledge to pull out what really matters, so that you can understand the context without the spin. Follow the Conversation Weekly for new episodes every Thursday wherever you listen to podcasts, and read more stories on theconversation.com.
Every book has two stories, the one it tells and the one it hides. If you're enjoying our show, we think you might like The Secret Life of Books. It's an addictive weekly podcast by Princeton professor Sophie G and former BBC producer Jonty Claypole. It uncovers the hidden stories behind iconic books, asking why did the author write them, what was going on at the time, and what's going on in the book that you didn't know. Discover the secret stories behind great books we think we know. This week, The Secret Life of Books is joined in conversation with the novelist Colm Tóibín. He's talking Henry James, why his great novels are still great, and how Colm learned to write from the classic novelist known as the Master. So go and check out The Secret Life of Books. There are lots of episodes about Jane Austen too. Sophie and Jonty read the classics so you don't have to. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts. Welcome back. I'm here with Olivia Robotham Carpenter, a lecturer in literature at the University of York. Welcome to the podcast, Olivia.
Hello, it's absolutely lovely to be here.
And Mark Manellis, you're a professor of 18th century studies at Queen Mary University of London. Welcome to you.
Hi, thank you very much. Yeah, pleased to be here.
So Jane Austen wrote Mansfield Park between 1811 and 1813, just a few years after slavery was abolished in Britain by an Act of Parliament in 1807. So we know Jane Austen was reading quite a bit about slavery by white writers, but do we know if she would have read anything by black agitators for abolition or any novels featuring black characters, Olivia?
Do we know this for certain? No. Is it entirely possible? Actually, yes. So if we think about the title, Mansfield Park, potentially pointing to Lord Mansfield, the justice who is going to rule on what becomes kind of known as the Mansfield decision, and is about whether or not slave laws as they applied on colonial soil would apply on British soil. These enslavers, they assumed actually that they could bring an enslaved man to be an enslaved servant on British soil, and then force him to go back to the slave plantation. And Lord Mansfield ends up ruling, actually, no, slave law doesn't apply on British soil, and slavers don't have the right to kidnap people on British soil in the same way that they would have that right on colonial soil. We know that there were black people in London coming to hear what was going on in court during this case, who had a celebration at a local pub afterwards. There is a thriving black population in England across the 18th and into the 19th century that have a community that are getting together, that are agitating. For Austen to be totally unaware of this strikes me as unlikely. Lord Mansfield is also going to be a judge who rules on a very important and very troubled legal case surrounding the Zong massacre during the period, which is about the murder of enslaved people on board a slave ship. Black activists are all over those cases that Lord Mansfield is ruling on.
So this is an extremely live issue for Austen. It sounds like it's sort of in every part of her world. Presumably, readers then coming across the title Mansfield Park would have immediately understood that context for it. Is that right, Mark?
I think that readers coming to a book called Mansfield Park would enjoy that context when they found it in the book. They'd say, oh yeah, the title, that makes total sense now. So she's sort of advertising the idea. And then this is a book which addresses the topic of British responsibility, wealthy British people's responsibility for a series of immoral acts in the colonies, which is summarised by the idea of slavery. So, yeah, I think that's exactly what she meant by the title, yeah.
So in Mansfield Park, we have two twinned estates. There's Mansfield Park, owned by the Bertram family, where Fanny Price is sent to live aged 10, and where the novel largely takes place. And then offstage, we have the plantation in Antigua, where the Bertrams make money through the labour of enslaved people. Early on in the novel, the head of the family, Sir Thomas Bertram, has to travel to Antigua for the better arrangement of his affairs after some recent losses. What exactly is going on here?
That's a really interesting statement, isn't it? When the book opens, we don't get the backstory about how the Bertrams came to be wealthy. So Sir Thomas is an absentee landlord, as he would say. He's living in Britain, but he owns this plantation in Antigua, and something's gone wrong, and it's not making the profits that it used to make, and he, in fact, decides he's going to have to go to Antigua. That's a really major and risky step to sort things out.
Why would that have been risky?
Well, I mean, travelling across the Atlantic at any time in the 18th century on board ship was risky, but going to the Caribbean was very dangerous for people's health. So an incredibly large proportion, I don't know exactly what, of white English people who went to the Caribbean would die within the first 2 or 3 months of tropical diseases, which they were not prepared for. Those who didn't then often, survived for many, many years. But it was also, Britain was at war. They are threatened by French privateers on the way back, I think. And what he wants to do is he wants to sort out what's happened on the estate. We don't really know what kind of estate it is, but I think the assumption should be that it's a sugar plantation. And so what could have gone wrong? It could have been a natural disaster, like a hurricane. There were important hurricanes in 1804, for example, in Antigua. Or the thing about slave plantations is that they survive by radical brutality. So they organise all their black slaves into gangs, organised groups of men, women and children, and force them to work by extreme violence. And that's actually quite hard to maintain. You need a certain kind of really brutalised person to do that to other people. And often it went wrong. So what he's going to do when he gets there, I think, is to make sure that the regime of coercive violence is extreme enough to keep up the production of sugar in the manner to which he wants it to be produced.
Is there a comment there about a sort of hypocrisy of a society that's benefiting from enslavement but not acknowledging it outright, Olivia?
I think so. The form of the novel itself is doing something rather fascinating and rather clever by making sure that this second estate remains off-page, but on characters' minds and an important kind of part of the plot. So there's this kind of worry a little bit early on in the novel that, Sir Thomas Bertram's had some business losses, and his eldest son, the less sympathetic of the two brothers,
that's Tom.
Tom has some gambling debts. And so between Tom's gambling debts and the losses on the plantation, they start to worry about their money just a little bit. Fundamentally, it only matters in relation to its young white protagonist. What does that mean for where Fanny's going to live? Okay, well, maybe Aunt Norris can take Fanny in. And I think that really tells us something quite important about how slavery, how these incredibly violent institutions are functioning at the level of the domestic household and what they might mean in actual British women's lives during the period, right? This kind of violence, is that going to show up at discussions at the tea table? Is that going to show up in household finances? Is that going to show up in what kinds of commodities we think we can or cannot buy? Prices of this or that, etc. It's structural to the novel itself. I mean, when I'm thinking about what Sir Thomas is going away to go deal with, he may well be going down because he needs to suppress an uprising, right? And we don't see him in that role out there. That's off page. But what we do see is he comes back and he corrects the behavior of people who are supposed to be behaving badly in his own household.
So the adult children have been putting on a play in Sir Thomas's absence, haven't they? And he comes back furious about this.
Yeah, he comes back furious that the family's been misbehaving and that fraternizing has been going on that was inappropriate and unbecoming of young ladies at the time. And so his role in his own household is to make sure people behave and people stay in line.
And when Sir Thomas does return from Antigua, Austen gives us a scene in which Fanny Price asks her uncle about the slave trade, though she doesn't press him on the matter after she is met by a dead silence. Now we hear this account after the fact as she discusses the moment with her cousin and love interest Edmund. In the years since Mansfield Park's publication, thousands of words have been dedicated to interpreting that metaphorically rich dead silence. Markman, how do you interpret that moment?
Yeah, it's a really interesting scene. So he's been talking about his experiences in the West Indies. And Fanny, around the tea table or at dinner, is the only one of the family who's interested and would like to know more. Her comment on the dead silence is on the rest of the family's lack of interest in the events that he's undertaken in Antigua. And it's such a resonant phrase, as you say, and people have made a lot of it over the years. So I think what Austen's saying there is that if we were going to sort of push it out a bit further and, gamble some interpretation, we could say that she finds the British middle class or the elite class failing to take responsibility for their moral turpitude, for the mistakes that they've made. And they do that by showing their lack of interest in such topics. There's a big debate at the period called amelioration, which was the idea that you could improve the quality of life of the enslaved people, and that would be fine. You wouldn't have to emancipate them or give them freedom. As long as you ameliorated their condition, that would be an adequate solution to the problem of slavery. Of course it isn't, because it's misses something really important about freedom and liberty. So what she wants to hear is how their lives have been improved. And, she's met with this dead silence and the family are not interested.
And Olivia, how do you interpret that scene, that moment?
In many ways, it's a fascinating moment because it marks this kind of really interesting point at which Fanny Price becomes the unlikely candidate to step forward as one of Austen's most politically checked-in heroines. Fanny Price is the one who is least in touch with her desires. She's our most repressed heroine. She is our most follow normative morals heroine. But she's the heroine that asks a very politically loaded question of an enslaver. So, whoa, Fanny, where'd that come from? I feel like there's a little bit of a Fanny Price redemption arc in that moment. Somebody asked the question that we may all have actually had on our minds since we saw that the title was Mansfield Park, and then we know about that plantation in Antigua. Is somebody going to name it? Is somebody even going to say the word slave in this novel? And finally, we get it in this moment that's a non-moment. In fact, as she's telling Edmund about it, Edmund was like, hey, you could have kept asking, And she says, I didn't want to seem more checked into these questions than his own daughters, so I just kind of let it drop. But actually, it would have mattered for her to step up, even if she herself doesn't seem to be aware of that importance. And that's also a crucial theme for this novel, right? Fanny is not self-aware enough about her own position in the house. She's not self-aware enough about her own potential for power. She's not self-aware enough about her own potential for desire. And so her relationship to politics is quite similar.
So women in Austen's day had to largely form their opinions about the slave trade based on information they read from men, whether they were reading books by men or hearing about it from men in their family. So I find it interesting that in that novel, at the moment Fanny asks her uncle about it, we, the reader, are also at a remove. Her conversation is discussed with Edmund after it has happened. Markman, why does Austen present the moment in this way, rather than inviting us into the scene?
Well, that's a really interesting question and well observed. I think Fanny is a really interesting character for Austen. She's what makes this book work, obviously, because it's focused on her, but also what makes Mansfield Park some people's favourite Austen novel, I think, because it's the most morally complicated in a way. The question of what's going to happen at the end remains in jeopardy until very close to the end, maybe. So I think part of Austen's plan is that we should learn more about how Fanny is growing. This is also the scene with all those sort of lubricious remarks that Sir Thomas makes about how she's grown up. Her body has grown up as a woman while he's been away. Which,
yeah, very uncomfortable scene. Olivia is making a throw-up face really, very appropriately.
It's really awkward. I think it was really awkward then too. Austen has put her in this position of risk and jeopardy, and she's showing that she does have a backbone. She is going to end up learning how to control, to make points, how to control herself and to make observations and make judgments, in that old-fashioned moral sense.
So coming back to something you were talking about earlier, Olivia, Fanny is for many readers of Austen, her most timid heroine, though it is the subject of debate. This character trait does make it easier for her perhaps to never draw any political conclusions of her own, though she does ask the question. For modern readers, Fanny's hesitance there and the fact that the question remains unresolved and not pushed further is quite frustrating. Why didn't Austen push it further in this regard?
I don't know if this is lending Austen interpretive grace, but I tend to think that this is less about Austen's politics and more about Fanny being unready for absolutely everything. Fanny is deeply, deeply isolated. by living with these people. And these people absolutely depend on that suppression of information in order to function. They themselves need not to be thinking too closely about where their money comes from. They themselves need to be not thinking too closely about their own morals if they're going to survive, if they're going to be able to be respectable, if they're going to be able to be civil, if they're going to be able to lounge on sofas and obsess about their pug dogs, whatever it is that they're doing.
As Lady Bertram does, Fanny's aunt, yes.
As Lady Bertram famously does, Pug! I'm somebody who loves pug dogs, but like those scenes are very troubling. Right? They've taken a child out of her home and treated her as a kind of pet, servant, family member, in-betweeny place. These are people that are doing quite morally objectionable things, and if Fanny is going to survive in that space, she better have a degree of emotional numbness.
And she is referred to as an object, a belonging, several times in the novel, isn't she?
Yeah, she really is. So I think the fact that Fanny doesn't step up and draw a political conclusion is in line with all the other ways stepping up and drawing a conclusion is unavailable to her. She goes on later to take at least some control over her emotional life and her desires, where she defies a very advantageous offer of marriage, right? She declines to do something that Sir Thomas Bertram is going to end up expecting of her. Fanny learns to say no to something. If we're going to extend a generous reading to Austen of what's going on there, is Austen drops it because Fanny has to.
Well, let's play around with a less generous reading of Austen.
Yeah, fair.
Markman, is there perhaps part of the appeal of writing a novel, the fact that, as opposed to polemic, there's room for ambivalence on issues like slavery?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fiction. She didn't set it in Antigua. She doesn't have a black character. All the things she could have done, she doesn't do. But nonetheless, this theme of British responsibility for colonial slavery is crucial to the way in which the novel's setup works. And she's certainly not addressing things directly, but I don't know whether her audience would have been ready for that. So there are novels which are set in Caribbean slave rebellions like William Earl's Obi or Three-Fingered Jack, and there are novels which depict, this is Olivia's topic really, but novels which depict black or mixed race heroines arriving from the Caribbean, like The Woman of Colour.
Yeah, Olivia, could you tell us a little bit more about those sorts of novels?
Yeah, Markman, I cite you in my book about them, so please, you've been part of this journey with me for a long time. So there are quite a lot of references to black characters in British novels, including the novel you just mentioned, Markman, a novel called The Woman of Colour, which came out in 1808 and features a black heroine who is in this kind of really strange predicament where she is born to an enslaved mother and an enslaver father, and her enslaver father puts in his will that she has to go to England and marry her white cousin. And this novel is all about how the character, who is, like myself, a mixed-race woman named Olivia, who moves to England, but no relation, I swear. Olivia moves to England and encounters all of these, what we sometimes like to call microaggressions or just plain racism. And she talks back to that racism. The thing about that novel that really irks me and irks several other scholars is that at the end of the novel, Olivia ends up kind of inheriting her father's plantation. And so she goes back and is kind of this mixed race elite enslaver. And she's quite invested in that kind of amelioration politics that you were talking about, Markman, where she is saying, I will bring about better food and Christian education as the kind of thing that slavery really needs, as opposed to down with the institution, let's set everybody free immediately. And, a lot of critics will fire back, well, setting everybody free isn't actually available to her. But when we're talking about, well, what's fiction doing with these moral gray areas and these ambivalences and these really, really tricky nuances, right? It's all very well to say, make sure to keep things nuanced. But when you're talking about violence, when you're talking about people's suffering, we're talking about torture, we're talking about sexual violence, we're talking about all of these horrible things. And that's, I think, where a lot of kind of frustration comes in. We're kind of hoping that somebody's just going to come right out and say, this has got to go. I won't say that we never see that in fiction, because we do, and we're going to continue to see it into the 19th century. We're going to see Black authors doing it for sure. In 1831, Mary Prince's narrative comes out, which is the first narrative from a Black woman to be published in Britain that we know of. She was enslaved in Bermuda, Turks Island, and Antigua. And she talks about these abuses taking place in between that 1807 abolition of the trade that we talked about, the actual kidnapping of people and buying and selling them, and the 1833 legal abolition of the institution itself, right, where slavery itself becomes illegal. That doesn't end up taking effect until 1838. But abolishing the slave trade didn't help. If what Fanny was really hoping her uncle was going to say was, well, now that the slave trade is over, I went back and I better managed the plantation by making sure everyone had Christian education and better food. People are still suffering. People are still being tortured. The slave trade isn't happening legally anymore, but it's still happening illegally. All of those abuses didn't get better. Mary Prince was there to tell us about this in really vivid terms well after Mansfield Park.
And another writer that's writing at the same time in Austen's lifetime is Mary Wollstonecraft, the women's rights advocate. She uses the word slave when describing the position of the wife within the family. And it's interesting that Fanny's surname in this novel is Price. Though it feels an uncomfortable comparison for modern readers, is there a sense that Austen is drawing parallels between enslavement and the position of women in Georgian society in Mansfield Park? Markman?
Yes, I think that is what she's doing. Probably if you imagine Mary Wollstonecraft and Jane Austen in the same room, they might not have got on that well. But I think that Jane Austen actually would quite have admired some of her arguments. And she is, I think, really curious about the ways in which marriage enslaves women. And enslaves is a strong term to use there, partly because, in a way, talking about it like that represses the actual coerced violence in the Caribbean. But it is a term that Mary Wollstonecraft uses, really interestingly, to describe the absence of rights to women in marriage. And, legal texts in the period thought of the relationship between husband and wife and master and slave in the same terms. And it's one of those really weird Austen puns that she would then call the character Fanny Price.
I mean, this is the conversation that often really gets my master's students going when I teach Mansfield Park is, okay, if slavery is primarily in this novel through hints, vague references, and then metaphors, does it only matter then in relation to the story that it tells about a young white woman's coming of age and what it says about the family dynamics in a white household? And a fair amount of my students draw the conclusion, actually, yes, Austen only cares about slavery in relation to what it tells us about white women at home. And that ends up being incredibly troubling and enraging for a lot of students, especially students who were really wanting something much more satisfying from the period to kind of confront these issues head on. We were talking about, okay, well, what would our friend the ungenerous interpretation of Jane Austen here look like? It can get pretty darn ugly, to be totally honest with you. Austen maybe never crosses that line because Jane Austen herself worries that she can't be seen to publicly cross that line if she really wants to inherit her aunt's money later, if she really wants her aunt's patronage. Maybe she can't be talking too much mess. In all of Austen's writings, Mansfield Park is one that's politically checked in a certain sense, but it isn't necessarily the most politically checked in one. I would have liked Austen to finish Sanditon, which I know is something we're going to talk about.
I'm so glad you brought that up because, when Jane Austen died in 1817, she was partway through writing Sanditon, a novel which actually featured a black character named Miss Georgiana Lambe. Olivia, do you want to tell us a bit more about that character and how that unfinished work might illuminate some of our understanding of Austen's politics?
Well, look, in my greatest archival dreams, somehow there was a finished manuscript of Sanditon. We were all wrong, and I go antique shopping in Britain and just magically pull out a full manuscript of Sanditon. And then in this elaborate fantasy, this full manuscript develops the sole character who is explicitly of African descent in Jane Austen's writings, and we do see Austen ready to go there in a way that she wasn't in Mansfield Park. Miss Lambe is a character of African descent, but it really matters that she's this incredibly wealthy character that the other characters in the story are quite fascinated by. Her money gives her special privileges, and her money also means that this fortune hunter kind of has his eye on her. And that's where the manuscript kind of leaves us.
Such a tease.
I know! If we think of her as this mixed-race heiress figure, kind of like Olivia from The Woman of Color, who's attracting this notice, right? What was Austen going to say about racism? Was Miss Lambe ever going to have some of these kinds of encounters with racism that we see Olivia have in The Woman of Color, for example? I think Sanditon is at least setting us up to go there a little bit more. Sanditon is curious.
It's so tantalising, and now I'm going to have an eye out in every antique shop that I ever visit in the vain hope. So just to finish off, if you had to both distill our discussion today and answer quite plainly, what were Jane's politics in relation to the transatlantic slave trade? And can we ever work it out from her fiction?
No, you can't work it out through her fiction. It's a way more complicated question because politics evolve over time. And I think Jane Austen was definitely abolition curious without ever giving us firm evidence that she wanted to go there in a way that would have been satisfying to her Black contemporaries and or to us as readers today who are wanting a politically radical Jane Austen. She's not going to give us what we want or what they wanted explicitly. She may have been on track to do so literally on the day she died. The Jane Austen lover in me keeps fingers and toes crossed that at least by end of life, that's who she was.
And Markman, for you?
Yeah, I think that Jane Austen is interested in abolition, and so we can say that she sees this as one topic where the question of British responsibility and British morality in a global sense is played out. And it's one which is actually quite flattering to her as a white British woman because abolition was a success of evangelical white Christians in their own estimation. So it's quite a comfortable place to be located. And it's quite, in a way, conservative because it doesn't want emancipation or rebellion. It wants servitude. It wants to turn slavery from brutal chattel slavery into kinder servitude-like slavery. So it does tell us quite a lot about her politics and does reveal quite a lot about the British moral responsibility for empire and the ways in which Britons can delude themselves about them not being responsible for it.
Well, thank you both for joining me as our Austinian political pundits today. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, thank you. I've learned a lot.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Jane Austen's Paper Trail, a podcast from The Conversation. Coming up in our next episode, who were Jane Austen's friends? We head to Box Hill to experience for ourselves that toe-curling scene in Emma.
Frank Churchill, who turns out to be something of a cad, he suggests that they play this game
and find out about Jane Austen's own treasured friendships.
It's actually extraordinary. I mean, there she is in an all-female house, largely, I think, free from want.
A huge thank you to Liverpool Docs and to our three experts, Corinne Fowler, Olivia Robotham-Carpenter and Markman Ellis. Markman's got a great Austen fact for you, so do keep listening after the credits. We also want to hear from you. We'll be featuring questions from listeners about Jane Austen's life and works in a special Q&A episode at the end of the series. Please do get in touch with us directly by email or send us a voice note to podcast@theconversation.com. That email again is podcast@theconversation.com. The senior producer for this series was Eloise Stevens, who did all our mixing and sound design too. Reporting from Naomi Joseph with production help from Jane Wright. Alistair Tibbett and Alice Mason do all our socials and promotion, and our executive producer is Gemma Ware. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wide audience. You can sign up for our free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. And please rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. And tell your friends and fellow Jane Austen fans about us too. All right, Markman, as you're nodding at me most enthusiastically, what's your favourite little known fact about Jane Austen?
Well, in 1814, on a trip to London, she writes to her sister Cassandra that she's going to go and pay the family's tea bill, the bill with their tea merchant, and her mother hasn't given her any money to do that. And she goes to pay her bill at a particular tea merchant, and it is Twinings of the Strand, and that shop is still there.
So we can still drink Jane Austen's favoured tea brand today.
Exactly.
Markman Ellis there. I'm Anna Walker, and this is Jane Austen's Paper Trail. Thanks for listening.
Do whales sneeze?
I'm not sure, but luckily I've got an amazing whale expert I can call on.
We essentially go out onto a boat, we go out to the sea, we look for whales, we see a whale breathing.
Who will take us through her experiments.
And then as the whale takes a breath, the drone is flown through the snot and will deliberately collect as much snot as possible.
And let us know the answer. How does that sound, Guy?
That would be fun.
Join us on The Conversation's Curious Kids, wherever you get your podcasts.